when an elderly woman discovered her mare was suddenly pregnant and going into an unusual labor. She checked the security cameras and uncovered a disturbing truth. "What's happening with Dorada?" Mrs. Castañeda wondered, observing the mare pacing back and forth with heaving chest and dilated nostrils. Her snorts cut through the tranquil morning air, and something in her gaze troubled the woman deeply. This wasn't like other nights, she thought. It was spring, and the sun was just beginning to illuminate the Castañeda family stable, casting long shadows across the hay. Dorada, the black mare they had received years ago, had always been a calm animal with a good temperament who preferred being around people rather than working in the fields. But today, something was clearly wrong. Her movements were restless, almost desperate, and the slight sheen of sweat on her coat proved she had endured a difficult night. Mrs. Castañeda approached the corral fence, raising her arm to stroke Dorada's soft mane. "Easy, girl," she murmured, trying to calm her. "Everything will be all right." But inside, her worry grew. She had seen these signs before in other animals over the years, but never in Dorada. She hadn't shown any signs of being pregnant, no behavioral changes, not even weight gain that might indicate the possibility of a foal on the way. And yet there she was, behaving as if something inside her was about to change forever. The woman knew she couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her cell phone, the device she didn't fully understand but knew how to use for urgent calls, and dialed the number everyone in town trusted, Dr. Montes. "Doc, it's me, Mrs. Castañeda," she said, trying to keep her voice steady though nervousness betrayed her. "I need you to come to the farm. Dorada is, well, something strange is happening." Dr. Montes arrived quickly. He was an older man with steady hands and a measured voice that inspired confidence. He had seen Dorada many times before for regular checkups and knew her as a strong, healthy animal. But when he entered the stable and observed the mare, he knew something wasn't right. Dr. Montes knelt to examine Dorada more closely, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of her condition. "She appears to be entering labor," he finally said, and those words landed like a stone in Mrs. Castañeda's stomach. "But we shouldn't rush to conclusions. I'll prepare in case there are complications." Mrs. Castañeda nodded, though surprise left her speechless for a few moments. How was this possible? Dorada had never left the farm, and everyone in town knew they didn't have a stallion. Something didn't add up, and that strange feeling stayed with her as she watched the doctor take out instruments and prepare the space for what was apparently about to happen. Night had fallen, but the air was heavy with tension. Mrs. Castañeda couldn't stay still. The starlight barely illuminated the stable, and she felt mystery surrounded every corner, as if the shadows were whispering secrets she needed to discover. With a mixture of nerves and determination, she decided she couldn't let more time pass. Questions were piling up in her head, and there was only one way to seek answers. "I'm going to check the cameras," she announced, heading toward the small office in the shed. Mr. Castañeda looked at her with a doubtful expression, but didn't object. He knew that once his wife set her mind to something, nothing could stop her. With firm steps, Mrs. Castañeda entered the room and turned on the monitor, which crackled a bit before fully lighting up. While waiting for the images to load, her mind wandered through possible explanations. Dorada has never been near a male, she thought, remembering how they always kept her away from other mares and stallions to avoid any risk. So how was it possible that she was about to give birth? As the images from recent days passed before her eyes, something in her stomach told her she would find something disturbing. And there it was, her heart skipped a beat. One night almost 2 months ago, just when everyone was sleeping, the camera showed a figure moving stealthily near Dorada's corral. At first, it was just a shadow, a silhouette that slid carefully through the side door. But then the weak, stable lights revealed something more. The figure of a woman pushing the door carefully, opening it just enough to let in a horse. Mrs. Castañeda leaned closer to the screen, her eyes fixed on every movement. She watched as the horse, clearly a stallion, crossed the threshold and headed directly toward where Dorada was. Her breathing quickened. That scene, which should have been ordinary, felt almost like a betrayal. "Who would dare to do something like this without telling us anything?" she murmured to herself. Mrs. Castañeda stopped the video and rewound, looking for a better view of the horse. She gasped when the image cleared. "Wind!" she exclaimed, instantly recognizing the animal. It was Felipe's horse, her neighbor of many years, a good man, she thought, always kind and willing to help. But then why? Who was the woman who had brought Wind to Dorada's corral? Because it wasn't Felipe, that was certain. With her heart pounding in her chest, she left the shed and found her husband waiting for her. "I found something," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk to Dr. Montez, and then I'm going to have a chat with Felipe." That night, she barely slept. Her mind kept replaying the camera images, and doubt turned into distrust. Why would someone bring Wind to Dorada without asking their permission? And more importantly, what implications would this have for the mare and the foal that was about to be born? As dawn broke, the first rays of sun barely peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in pink and orange hues. But Mrs. Castañeda's heart felt none of the calm of a peaceful morning. She had barely managed to sleep during the night, and what little rest she got was plagued with restless dreams, as if her subconscious was struggling to find answers that wouldn't come. When she finally got up, the first thing she did was head to the stable. Dorada was still there in her corral, but something in her movements had changed. The mare walked back and forth, as if seeking comfort in the swaying of her steps. Mrs. Castañeda approached slowly, her heart heavy, and extended her hand to pet her. "Easy, Dorada, easy," she murmured, though the anxiety in her voice betrayed those words. It wasn't long before Dr. Montez arrived, his expression more serious than usual, which only increased the knot in Mrs. Castañeda's stomach. "How is Dorada?" he asked while approaching with his medical bag in hand. "She won't stop moving, doctor, and I think the contractions are stronger." "I don't know what to do," she admitted, feeling a weight in her chest. She had cared for Dorada for years, but had never seen anything like this, and the worry about what they had discovered on the cameras still haunted her mind like a ghost that refused to disappear. Dr. Montez began examining Dorada, measuring her breathing and palpating her abdomen. His movements were slow and careful, but the tension in his face revealed that something wasn't right. After a few minutes of silence, he turned to Mrs. Castañeda with a serious expression. "The foal isn't positioned correctly," he said finally, and those words hit like a stone in Mrs. Castañeda's stomach. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm going to prepare in case there are complications. If we don't manage to turn it, there could be serious complications." The doctor's words left her breathless for a moment. "But something can be done?" she asked, trying to maintain calm while fear grew inside her. "Yes, but it will be complicated. I'm going to need help to try to move the foal into the correct position. If we don't succeed, Dorada could be in danger." The gravity in the doctor's voice. He left no room for doubt. They had to act, and quickly. Mr. Castañeda, who had been listening from the stable door, entered to help. "Tell me what to do, doctor," he said with a firmness in his voice that tried to hide his own fear. During the next minutes, the stable filled with frantic movements and whispers of support while Dr. Montez and Mr. Castañeda worked together, following each instruction with precision. Mrs. Castañeda stayed by Dorada's head, stroking her mane and speaking softly. "Everything will be all right, girl. We're here with you," she repeated over and over, as if those words could conjure a miracle. But deep down, her thoughts kept returning to the images of the mysterious woman on the cameras, the same one who had brought Wind to the corral without permission. There were so many unanswered questions, and although she knew that right now the most important thing was saving Dorada, she couldn't help feeling that everything was connected somehow. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, Dr. Montez finally leaned back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We've managed to turn it," he said, and for the first time let out a small smile. "Now we just need to wait for Dorada to do the rest." There was a brief moment of relief in the air, but it didn't last long. The contractions intensified, and each one seemed like a struggle for poor Dorada. The mare snorted and trembled, her hooves striking the ground with a desperation that broke the heart. Mrs. Castañeda stayed by her side, holding her, whispering that everything would be fine, though her own hands trembled with fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dorada let out a strong whinny, one that resonated throughout the stable, and with one last effort, the foal came into the world. It was small, fragile, covered in birth fluid, but it was there alive. For a moment, everyone held their breath, waiting to see if it would move, if it would breathe. And then it did. The little foal moved its legs, trying to stand, and let out a soft sound that made Mrs. Castañeda break into tears of relief. "Thank God," she whispered, looking at Dorada with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, girl." But the joy lasted only briefly when Dr. Montez approached to examine the foal. His expression changed. There was something strange about it, something that didn't fit right. "This isn't normal," he murmured and turned to Mrs. Castañeda, who was still drying her tears. The foal, still covered in hay and with trembling legs, was trying to stand. Its tiny body moved awkwardly, but there was something in its posture, in the way its limbs seemed to twist slightly, that didn't seem natural. Dr. Montez observed it with the concentration of someone searching for answers amid confusion. But Mrs. Castañeda only saw a creature that had fought so hard to be born and now seemed to be paying the price for that struggle. "Doctor, what's wrong?" she asked, breaking the silence that had settled in the stable. Her voice came out low, almost as if she feared frightening the foal with her words. "What's wrong with the little one?" The doctor straightened up and sighed deeply, cleaning his hands with a handkerchief he carried in his pocket. "I can't say with certainty, Mrs. Castañeda, but there are signs that worry me. It seems his joints haven't developed properly, and his spine, there's something strange in the way it curves." He paused, looking at the foal that continued struggling to stand. It could be a genetic deformity, or it could be related to the way it was conceived. The doctor's last words left Mrs. Castañeda frozen. "The way it was conceived," she repeated, as if those words made no sense to her. But they did, because in her mind returned the security camera images, Wynn's silhouette entering Dorada's corral, the mysterious figure who had let it all happen without anyone knowing. The anguish transformed into a sense of urgency, and she knew she could no longer. "Stand ide. We can't just leave things like this, doctor," she said firmly, trying to maintain composure. "I have to know who it was, why they did this, and if Wind is involved, we need answers from Felipe." The next day, the Castañedas prepared for what they knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. The morning was cold despite the sun shining high in the sky. Mrs. Castañeda had dressed in her best coat, not because she wanted to impress, but because she wanted to feel protected, as if the thick fabric could shield her from the difficult words that were to come. Felipe received them on his house's porch with a puzzled expression. He had received Mr. Castañeda's call early in the morning, and although his neighbor hadn't given details, the tone of the conversation let him know something wasn't right. "Good morning, Felipe," Mr. Castañeda greeted with a seriousness that wasn't usual for him. "We need to talk to you about something we discovered." Felipe invited them inside the house, but Mrs. Castañeda shook her head. "We prefer to stay here if you don't mind," she said. She didn't want to be surrounded by walls when the storm she sensed was coming would break loose. "What's this about?" Felipe asked, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Castañeda took a moment before responding. "We've had a very strange situation with Dorada last night. When she gave birth, Dr. Montez noticed something odd about the foal, and well, we checked the security cameras. We saw Wind, your horse, in our corral. Do you know anything about this?" Felipe blinked, clearly surprised. "Wind? No. I had no idea. He's in the stable every night. I haven't noticed him going out." He stopped for a moment, as if something had just crossed his mind. "But lately I've seen Sonia behaving strangely. I didn't want to tell you without being sure, but maybe we should talk to her." Mrs. Castañeda felt the pressure in her chest intensify. She had expected Felipe to deny everything, to insist that Wind had never left his stable, but the mention of Sonia confirmed her worst suspicions. She had seen a woman's figure in the cameras, but she never imagined it could be Sonia, Felipe's daughter, who had always been so kind and reserved. "Then we'd better clear this up now," Mrs. Castañeda said, leaving no room for further doubts. "Call Sonia. We need to know why she did this." Felipe went back inside the house and returned a few minutes later with Sonia beside him. The young woman looked nervous, her shoulders tense and her gaze fixed on the ground. Mrs. Castañeda noticed she could barely look her father or the Castañedas in the eye, and that already told her much. Sonia stopped in front of the Castañedas, her her shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. Mrs. Castañeda observed every small movement of the young woman, looking for any sign of sincerity or remorse. The air felt dense, charged with the tension of unspoken words, and the silence on Felipe's porch was almost unbearable. "I want you to explain to me what happened," Mrs. Castañeda finally said, her voice firm but contained, as if she was struggling to maintain calm. "Why did you bring Wind to Dorada's corral without telling us anything?" Sonia raised her gaze for just a moment, long enough to see the serious faces of the Castañedas and the worry in her father's eyes. She bit her lip, searching for the right words, but knew that no excuse would be enough to fix what she had done. "I thought I was doing something good," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My family. We're going through a difficult time, economically speaking. When I learned that Wind was of such a valuable breed, I thought if Dorada had a foal from him, I could sell it and help us with the money." The words came out as if they were too heavy to say all at once. Mrs. Castañeda felt anger building inside her like a river threatening to overflow. She had dedicated her life to caring for Dorada, ensuring she lived in peace, and now she discovered that everything had been manipulated in an attempt at profit. The idea that someone had used Dorada for such a selfish plan turned her stomach. "And you thought there was no problem with that?" Mrs. Castañeda asked, her voice now tinged with disbelief and anger. "You thought you could bring Wind in the darkness of night and do everything without telling anyone? Dorada isn't just an animal to us. She's part of our family." Sonia shuddered at Mrs. Castañeda's harsh tone, but didn't look away this time. "I know, and I don't want to justify what I did," she said with a tremor in her voice. "I was wrong, and I'm very sorry. I just wanted to help my dad and myself. I didn't think things would get so complicated." Felipe, who until that moment had remained silent, turned to his daughter with a mixture of sadness and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me anything, Sonia?" he asked, his voice low and heavy. "If you needed help, you should have talked to me. You can't do things like this without thinking about the consequences." Tears began to run down Sonia's cheeks, and at that moment she looked smaller, like a child who had made a mistake too big to understand. "I didn't want to worry you more," she said, wiping away tears with her sleeve. "All I wanted was to find a solution, but now I see that I only made things worse." Mrs. Castañeda took a deep breath, trying to maintain calm while her thoughts spun frantically. She had expected answers, but Sonia's confession had brought with it more questions and complications. She didn't know what to do with the information she had just received. The only clear thing was that she couldn't let everything stay as it was. Dorada and the foal deserved more than that. "I'm sorry you're going through problems, Sonia, I truly am," she said, her voice lowering in tone though anger still showed in her eyes. "But that doesn't justify what you did. You had no right to make decisions about Dorada, much less in that way." Sonia nodded, accepting the words as if they were a punishment she knew she deserved. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to make up for it, to help the foal and Dorada," she offered, though her voice sounded weak and broken. Mrs. Castañeda closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself before responding. There were many mixed emotions in her heart: fury at the betrayal, sadness over the situation, and also a small spark of empathy towards Sonia, who had gotten herself into a situation she clearly didn't know how to get out of. "I don't know if there's anything you can do to fix this," she finally said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the young woman. "What I do know is that I don't want to see you near Dorada or our ranch again. This situation has been painful enough for everyone, and I think it's best if you keep your distance." The words fell like a sentence, and the pain on Sonia's face was evident, but she didn't protest. She didn't plead. She just nodded, accepting Mrs. Castañeda's decision, knowing that her mistakes had led her to this point. "I understand," she murmured, looking at her father. "Dad, forgive me. I didn't want things to end up like this." After the tense confrontation with Sonia, Mrs. Castañeda returned to the farm with less weight on her chest, but with a sadness that clung to her heart like a thorn. It had been difficult to tell the young woman never to return, but she knew it was necessary. She needed to protect Dorada and the little foal that had come into the world amid so much confusion and pain. Now, with Sonia away, the Castañeda family could focus on what was most important: caring for their animals, and ensuring something like this would never happen again. Night had fallen by the time Mrs. Castañeda reached the stable. Everything was calm, with only the soft sighs of the mares and the faint whisper of wind sneaking between the wooden boards. Dorada was lying down, resting after everything that had happened, and, beside her, the little foal moved its ears curiously, still wobbling on its thin legs but growing steadily firmer. Mrs. Castañeda approached with slow steps, her boots sinking slightly into the hay, and crouched beside them. "Hello, little one," she whispered, stroking Dorada's neck. The mare raised her head to look at her with those deep, wise eyes that always seemed to understand more than they could express. "Everything will be all right, you know. We're going to take care of you and your baby. No one is going to harm you." The foal, which until that moment had been clumsily exploring the stable, approached Mrs. Castañeda and sniffed her hands as if wanting to get to know her. It was so small and fragile, but in its movements there was an energy that reminded her of Dorada herself when she was young, full of life and curiosity. Mrs. Castañeda smiled, feeling something warm melting in her chest, and for a moment forgot everything that had happened. "Bronze," she said softly, as if testing the name on her lips. "That's what I'm going to call you, because you're a gift to all of us. A gift we weren't expecting, but one that has brought hope." While stroking Bronze's soft head, she felt that for the first time in a long while, there was a small spark of happiness amidst all the storm. The next day, the Castañeda family gathered around the kitchen table, where the morning sun illuminated their still tired but determined faces. They had spent a long night discussing what they would do from now on. There were many decisions to make, and Mrs. Castañeda knew she had to be firm. They couldn't allow any more mistakes. "We have to make sure this doesn't happen again," she said, looking at her husband and children. "I'm going to improve the ranch's security. We need higher fences, and I'm going to install more cameras. We can't rely on good luck to keep our mares safe." Mr. Castañeda nodded, understanding the seriousness of his wife's words. "Whatever you say, woman. You've always known what's best for the animals, and I'm going to support you." He knew she had spent sleepless nights thinking about how to protect Dorada, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary to help. But beyond security, there was another deeper concern. Dr. Montez had mentioned that the little foal needed special attention due to its complicated birth, and Mrs. Castañeda wasn't going to leave anything to chance. She decided that apart from reinforcing security, she would also ensure that Bronze received the best possible care. "I'm going to talk to Dr. Montez about coming more often to check on Bronze," she said. "I don't care if we have to spend more. I want to make sure he grows up healthy and strong." The decision was met with nods of agreement. The Castañeda family had always put their animals' welfare above everything else, and this time would be no different. So during the following weeks, they dedicated more time than ever to the stable. Mr. Castañeda reinforced the fences, installed new locks, and helped place cameras at strategic points, while Mrs. Castañeda spent mornings petting Dorada and caring for Bronze, watching each of his developments and making sure he fed well. The first weeks weren't easy. Bronze was fragile and needed more care than other foals. But little by little he began to strengthen, running a bit further each day and exploring his small world with the typical curiosity of his age. The entire family devoted themselves to him, not just out of obligation, but because they had found in this little foal a source of joy that helped them heal. One afternoon, as Mrs. Castañeda was watching Bronze trot around the corral, she felt a deep satisfaction. It was like seeing something reborn that had been damaged, like a flower growing after a long drought. At that moment, she realized she had done the right thing in confronting Sonia and demanding she stay away. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, but at least she could ensure the future would be different. "You're a fighter, Bronze," she said aloud, as if the foal could understand her. "Just like your mother, and I'll always be here for you both, to care for you, to protect you." The days passed, and life on the Castañeda farm began to regain its usual rhythm, though Bronze's presence had added a touch of joy that hadn't been felt in a long time. Every morning, Mrs. Castañeda would wake up early, prepare herself a strong coffee, and head to the stable, where she was always greeted by Dorada's soft whinnies and Bronze's playful movements. Despite everything that had happened, She had found comfort in these small moments of peace, in the sound of hooves against the earth, and in the sweet gaze of her Mares. One afternoon, while Mrs. Castañeda was brushing Dorada under the shade of an old oak tree, she heard the sound of a car approaching. She looked up and saw Felipe walking toward her with a serious but calm demeanor. Several weeks had passed since their last conversation, and although they hadn't avoided each other, they hadn't spoken much either. Mrs. Castañeda knew he had been keeping his part of the agreement. Wind remained in his stable, and Felipe had made sure there were no more incidents. "Good afternoon, Felipe," she greeted him, setting aside the brush. "Is everything all right?" Felipe nodded, though there was slight discomfort in his expression. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Castañeda. I just wanted to talk a bit, if you don't mind." Mrs. Castañeda took off her work gloves and nodded. "Of course, come on. What's this about?" Felipe took a deep breath, as if searching for the right words. "First of all, I wanted to thank you for what you did. I know this whole thing with Sonia was complicated, and you could have taken harsher actions, but you chose not to. I want you to know that I value that, and I'm also very sorry for what happened." Mrs. Castañeda listened in silence, nodding occasionally. She had spent many nights thinking about that decision, about whether she had done right in not reporting Sonia. But in the end, she had chosen to leave the matter behind, thinking that the best way to move forward was to ensure it wouldn't happen again. "I appreciate your words, Felipe," she said finally, "and I hope Sonia is well. But we need to be clear. What happened cannot be repeated." Felipe lowered his head, ashamed but grateful. "I know, and I promise you wine won't come near Dorada unless you permit it." He paused before continuing, as if what he was about to say cost him a bit more. "But I also wanted to talk to you about Wind. I know he's part of this, and that for you he represents a reminder of what happened, but I want you to know that it was never my intention for him to cause problems. Wind is important to me." Mrs. Castañeda looked at him, understanding her neighbor's dilemma. Wind wasn't to blame for anything, and although the circumstances had been difficult, he was also a living being that deserved care and attention. "Felipe, I have nothing against Wind," she responded softly. "What I want is for him to be well cared for, not to suffer because of decisions others made. If you're willing to ensure that, then I think we can find a way to move forward without any problems."